Welcome back. Siegfried Waggener Radio analysis of propaganda. Today is July 19th, 2013, and we're reading the shortwave broadcast from Monday, March 9th, 1942, that was read between 7:15 and 7:30 p.m. Mountain West Time. From MBS KFEL Radio, an analysis of propaganda by Siegfried Waggener. Good evening. Many of the listeners to this program have written, this is a great show. Many of the listeners to this program have written me requesting that I tell my audience something about my background and the story of Mutual KFEL shortwave listening post which I operate. Much of this curiosity has been caused, I am sure, by my unmistakable German accent and by my likewise unmistakable German name. That a man can become an enemy of the country in which he was born and raised is nothing new in the annals of American history, and thus, my case is no exception, and as by and large I do not think that it is an exceptional at all. When I left Germany in January of 1926, I was one of many Europeans who was convinced that the end of European culture and civilization was rapidly approaching, and that anyone who did not want to give up all hope and faith in humanity had better go to a country where a branch of that humanity was vigorously building a new world. And there was only one country in the whole wide world where that was done, and that's the United States of America. USA. And it still is today. Turn off your TV sets, turn off your radios, go outside. When I left Germany in January 1926, I was one of the many Europeans who was convinced that the end of European culture and civilization, the EU, the European Neighborhood Policy, that's ending this year. So he left Germany in 1926. He gave up all hope in Europe. He said, and anyone who did not want to give up all hope and faith in humanity had better go to a country where a branch of that humanity was vigorously building a new world. And there was only one country in the whole wide world where that was done, and that's the United States of America. Since my childhood in the city of my birth, Hanover, Germany, America had been my dreamland. It all started, of course, with the many books I read about the early pioneers of America and their fights with the Indians. But due to my father, who was one of those Germans who seem to have been exterminated now by Hitler because they never gave up fighting for liberty and democracy, the word America soon took a deeper and greater meaning. Even during the last war, my father never referred to the Kaiser by any other name than the German equivalent for that nitwit Willie. And what he said about the Junkers and generals of Prussia cannot be repeated in a polite language. It was my father who prevented me, I was then a boy of 15, from joining the German army. As a volunteer in 1914, and when I was finally drafted in 1916, barely 18 years old, I was one of those half-children about whom Erich Maria Remarque wrote that the great but tragic book, All Quiet on the Western Front. At our training camp near the Russian border, in the icy winter of 1916 and 1917, nearly every night, one or two young soldiers committed suicide. Every night, some German kid committed suicide. One or two soldiers. Some by the very ingenious method of filling a rifle barrel with water, loading it with a stolen blank cartridge. We had no access to sharp ammunition, and blowing their heads off by holding the muzzle in their mouth. When we heard a muffled shot out in the hallway or a heavy thud outside in the barracks, we knew what it meant, even though we were not permitted to leave our rooms and go help or find out what happened. This desperation among the youngest draftees and the last reserve of the German army was caused by the inhuman treatment at the hands of the Prussian officers for whom we were nothing but cannon fodder, and who had no other interest but to make tough fighting men within 3 months out of hollow-eyed, undernourished, underdeveloped, and physically weak youngsters. They didn't fight for freedom. They only succeeded in driving all patriotism out of these boys. So instead of making them proud to be German, they drove it all out of them. And making them so scared and disillusioned that when they arrived at the battlefront, they were the same bewildered, confused, hysterical, crying kids about whom the American doughboys have told and written so many stories. So Americans are exact opposite. Maybe Hitler's ruthless propaganda methods, which have been so aptly called education for death, succeeded in raising young German generation in a brutal, fanatical desire to die as a hero. But I doubt it. These premises today are the same as in 1917 and 1918. Hitler's last reserves are called after they have suffered years of near starvation, after they have seen their mothers, sisters, and fathers dwindle away in a war effort which at first seemed glorious, but which in the end has lasted too long. Thus, mentally and physically weakened, they will be subjected to the same brutal and desperate training methods which will break them down rather than build them up, which made a revolutionary out of me in 1917. So he turned into a revolutionary against Germany because he was in the German army and because of how they treated him and watching all these kids commit suicide to get out of it. And just the way he was too smart for them. Because Hitler today, as the Kaiser in 1917, has to throw everything into the fight, regardless of the cost, in order to gain a decision before Russia and the United States have developed their full fighting strength. This is a struggle against time, in which the education for death and all that his propaganda tricks will finally be smashed by that very human element which he liked, all half-cocked militarist disregarded, maimed, and trampled on. That's a hard sentence. This is a struggle against time, in which his education for death and all his other propaganda tricks will finally be smashed by that very human element which he, like all half-cocked militarist, disregarded, maimed, and trampled on. If he knows what happened after the Peace of Brest-Litovsk, when tens of thousands of German soldiers returning from Russian prison camps refused to take up arms again and committed mutiny on such a scale as to make the Kaiser's government helpless to deal with them according to martial law. Really? So the German soldiers were in Russian prisoner of war camps, were released, came back to Germany, wouldn't fight, wouldn't help with martial law, and ended up bringing down the Kaiser. Then he knows how the end of a regime like his own comes about. That's talking about Hitler. I saw it happen, and I, like counted other German soldiers who were still loyal to the Kaiser's government. I saw it happen, and like uncounted other German soldiers who were still loyal to the Kaiser's government, caught the idea like a fever. From then on, everyone for himself, but all united in a common cause, fought for the overthrow of the Kaiser's government and the establishment of a German republic. But first of all, for peace and the return of a square meal. They were just starving. And they wanted peace. They wanted food and peace. Somebody's going to bring that. I want freedom and food and peace. Freedom and liberty in pursuit of happiness. The Kaiser had forgotten the human element in his people, and wherever I went among soldiers or munition workers, I found ears and hands willing to help. We were not communists. We only wanted democracy and peace. And so that fateful 9th of November 1918 found me in the capital of Berlin, where on the night before I helped leading the first revolutionary mass demonstration, 10,000 unarmed men and women shouting, "Bread and peace," until police began moving on us with November 9th, 1918, helped leading the first revolutionary mass demonstration, just a demonstration. 10,000 unarmed men and women shouting bread and peace. That's all they were doing. until police began mowing us down with machine guns. So 10,000 Germans saying, "We're starving, give us bread." And they want peace. And the German army is like, just killing them all. The next day, commanding a train of armored trucks, because the peace is over then. You know, you start mowing down the people that are just marching, and then that's it. The next day, commanding a train of armored trucks, I took possession for revolutionary government of the Admiralty Building, the high command of the German Navy, and the following Sunday I forced the resignation of the quartermaster of the general of the Berlin Army Corps area by turning the life-size pictures of the Kaiser in Hindenburg in his office toward the wall, which shows what a comic opera revolution it really was. So you just turn around the pictures and face them to the wall. But the next day, the 11th, the guns ceased firing at the front. Young as I was at the time, I saw clearly that the newly born German Republic got off on a bad start. Discredited and shifty politicians like Philipp Scheidemann grabbed while nobody else was looking. Nobody cared. What was to be a revolution was nothing but the final breakdown of a completely worn out people. That's how the seeds of Hitler started. Because if you're a completely worn down people and you look around and you go, if I just get rid of the less thans, get rid of the Jews, get rid of everybody that's not as good as us, instead of coming up with a plan on how to make your country better, a lot of people are going to listen. After helping in the establishment of the semblance of law and order, I returned to civilian life and started my career as a journalist by becoming editor and publisher of a movie magazines. Those post-war years from 1918 to 1925, when I finally left Germany, were one uninterrupted session of nightmares. I saw the whole nation go to pieces under the after effects of the war, and I came up against the Nazi menace for the first time when the great German Austrian Alpine Club, of which I was a member, introduced the infamous Aryan Clause in 1924. What's the Aryan Clause of 1924? This prohibited Jews to join the club, even though the money contributors of the Jewish members were largely instrumental in the building of the club's magnificent shelters in the hotels of the High Alps. So from 1918 to 1925, it was just the end of the revolution, the end of World War I. Everyone's starving. They're all countries torn apart. In 1924, the Hitler ban started and made the Aryan Clause and prohibited Jews to join. But they were happy to keep the Jews' buildings, happy to take their money.